The column moved in the dark because Russian commanders believed the dark was still enough. Trucks and armored personnel carriers carrying infantry reinforcements toward the forward positions in eastern Ukraine, moving at reduced speed on a road that Ukrainian forces had been watching for weeks, using the mid-April night as their cover in a conflict where night has not been a reliable cover for Russian forces for a very long time. Ukrainian drone operators with thermal imaging had been tracking the column from the moment it departed its assembly point. Every vehicle, every interval, every turn in the road. The thermal signatures of truck engines and armored vehicle exhaust were as visible on the drone operator's screen as vehicle headlights would have been in peacetime. The darkness that Russian commanders had calculated as concealment was, through the lens of Ukrainian thermal observation, simply a backdrop. The column was bringing reinforcements. Somewhere on the eastern front, a Russian unit was short on infantry, depleted by the attrition of days or weeks of fighting, requesting replacements to restore its capability for the offensive operations that Russian commanders continued to plan. The trucks and BTRs moving in the mid-April darkness were carrying those replacements. Soldiers who had traveled from assembly areas in the Russian rear, who were hours from reaching their assigned positions, who represented the forward edge of the Russian manpower pipeline that feeds the front. They never arrived. This is the story of how Ukrainian FPV teams, working in coordination with thermal drone observation and a carefully prepared engagement plan, intercepted a Russian reinforcement column in the narrow terrain corridor that Ukrainian commanders had identified as the optimal engagement point, and destroyed it completely before it could reach the front line it was traveling toward. The intelligence preparation for this engagement had been building over several days. Ukrainian drone operators conducting routine surveillance of the road network in the sector had mapped the Russian logistics and movement patterns with the patience that persistent observation develops. Russian commanders, using this specific road corridor for resupply and reinforcement movement, had been doing so with sufficient regularity that Ukrainian analysts had developed confidence in their movement timing. The general windows during which traffic was most likely, the direction of movement that indicated reinforcement versus resupply, the vehicle compositions that suggested specific types of cargo or personnel. The narrow stretch of road that Ukrainian commanders selected as the engagement point had been identified through terrain analysis as the location where the tactical geometry was most favorable. On one side of the road, a tree line that would channel FPV drone approaches without exposing them to vehicle-mounted early warning systems. On the other side, a drainage channel that mid-April water levels had filled to the point where vehicles attempting to leave the road surface would immediately become mired in the soft, water-saturated ground. The road itself at this point was effectively a channel. Vehicles on it could move forward or backward, but could not disperse laterally. A column trapped at this point would be sealed from the moment the first and last vehicles were disabled. Ukrainian FPV teams moved into their positions during the afternoon before the expected movement window. They used the daylight hours to establish themselves in the tree line, moving carefully, establishing communications with the drone observation element that would be maintaining overhead coverage of the road corridor, confirming their positions relative to the engagement geometry that the plan had specified. By the time darkness fell, the FPV teams were in place, their systems charged, their approach corridors planned, their engagement sectors assigned. The drone observation element maintained continuous coverage of the road from the column's departure point forward. When the column began to move in the late evening hours, the observation team confirmed its composition, more vehicles than the minimum estimate had projected. The column consisted of 4 cargo trucks carrying dismounted infantry, 3 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers with additional soldiers on the decks and inside, and 2 light support vehicles. 9 vehicles total, carrying what Ukrainian analysts estimated was a reinforcement element of between 60 and 80 soldiers. The confirmation was transmitted to the FPV teams. The engagement window was opened. The column's lead vehicle, the first BTR-82A, reached the engagement point at the narrow stretch of road between the tree line and the drainage channel, at a time when the mid-April night was at its darkest, the period between moonset and the first gray of pre-dawn, when thermal imaging provides its greatest relative advantage over naked-eye observation. The Ukrainian drone operator maintaining overhead coverage confirmed the lead vehicle's position and transmitted the engagement trigger. The first FPV drone launched from the tree line and struck the lead BTR-82A from the side, hitting the vehicle's engine compartment, disabling it in place on the narrow road. The vehicle stopped. The road was blocked at the forward end. 4 seconds later, the second drone struck the rearmost vehicle in the column. One of the cargo trucks, chosen as the rear seal rather than an armored vehicle because its larger profile made it easier to place precisely across the road surface in a way that would physically block the vehicles ahead of it from reversing. The truck stopped, its engine compartment destroyed, its cab on fire. The road was now sealed at both ends. What remained inside the sealed corridor were 7 vehicles, 3 BTRs and 4 cargo trucks, carrying the majority of the reinforcement element. Ukrainian FPV operators working from the tree line could observe each vehicle through their thermal systems. The occupants of the trucks, who had no overhead armor protection, began attempting to dismount and seek cover. The BTR crews, better protected, initially attempted to maneuver. The lead BTRs in the column tried to push the disabled lead vehicle off the road to create an exit, a maneuver that required them to stop and engage the disabled vehicle at close range, and that presented their flanks to the drone operators in the tree line. The engagement sequence that followed was systematic. Ukrainian FPV operators worked through the column from the already disabled ends inward, targeting vehicles in the order that maximized the physical blocking effect of each subsequent disabled vehicle. The BTRs that had attempted to maneuver against the disabled lead vehicle were struck while stationary, their flanks exposed, their crews focused on the vehicle in front of them, rather than the drones coming from the tree line. Russian soldiers who dismounted from the trucks and attempted to move off the road met the drainage channel on one side and the tree line on the other. The tree line, from which Ukrainian drone operators were working and where Ukrainian infantry observation posts had been established. Movement toward the tree line was met with direct fire from those observation posts. Movement toward the drainage channel meant entering water and mud that the mid-April thaw had filled to a depth that made movement extremely difficult and that offered no cover from overhead observation. The engagement lasted approximately 25 minutes from the first drone strike to the last. By the time Ukrainian commanders assessed the engagement as complete, 8 of 9 vehicles had been destroyed or disabled. The 9th, a cargo truck at the middle of the column, whose driver had executed an immediate reversal when the first strikes hit and had driven backward off the road at a point where the drainage channel was shallower, had escaped the corridor. It was pursued by a drone from the observation element, which tracked it for several hundred meters before the truck reached a point where the terrain provided cover from the drone's approach angle. The truck was subsequently reported as destroyed by Ukrainian artillery acting on the observation drone's tracking data. 9 vehicles, 0 survivors of the vehicle crew, and mounted infantry reaching the positions they were traveling toward. The reinforcement column that a Russian frontline unit had been waiting for did not arrive. Now let us examine precisely what this engagement cost Russia. The vehicle losses represent the most straightforward component of the material cost. 3 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers destroyed. At a replacement cost of approximately $1.2 to $1.8 million USD each under current Russian procurement conditions, the BTR losses represent $3.6 to $5.4 million. 4 cargo trucks destroyed. Military cargo trucks capable of the load capacity required for infantry transport carry replacement costs of $150,000 to $300,000 each, for a combined $600,000 to $1.2 million. 2 light support vehicles, $200,000 to $400,000 combined. Total vehicle replacement cost, $4.4 to $7 million USD. The personnel cost is substantially more significant in operational terms. The reinforcement column was carrying between 60 and 80 soldiers, infantry replacements destined for a frontline unit that had been depleted and was waiting for them. At current Russian mobilization and training costs for infantry, each soldier represents a state investment of $15,000 to $25,000 in direct training, equipment, and logistical costs. The personnel cost of the column's destruction, $900,000 to $2 million in direct investment cost. But the operational cost of this personnel loss extends far beyond the training investment figure. The Russian frontline unit that was expecting these reinforcements does not receive them. Its combat power remains at the depleted level that prompted the reinforcement request. The offensive operations that Russian commanders had planned around the assumption of restored infantry strength must be postponed, scaled back, or executed with an understrength force that accepts higher casualty rates to achieve the same objectives. That delay, the gap between when the reinforcement was supposed to arrive and when a replacement reinforcement column can be organized and move forward, is measured in days at minimum. During those days, the depleted Russian unit continues to hold its positions at reduced effectiveness. Ukrainian defenders facing that unit have time that they would not have had if the reinforcements had arrived. Time for position improvement. Time for rotation of their own tired personnel. Time for the maintenance and resupply activities that active Russian pressure had been interrupting. The cascading operational effect of destroying a reinforcement column is not limited to the vehicles and personnel lost. It extends through the entire operational schedule of the unit that was supposed to receive those reinforcements, delaying the tempo of Russian operations in that sector, and providing Ukrainian defenders with the operational breathing room that denied Russian pressure creates. Russian military logistics planners will organize another reinforcement column. They will attempt to route it differently, through different corridors, at different times, with different vehicle spacing. Ukrainian drone operators will watch those corridors with the same persistence and the same thermal observation capability that track this column. The tactical details will differ. The outcome has been consistent. The mid-April night that Russian commanders chose as their cover was not a cover. Ukrainian thermal drone operators were watching every vehicle from the moment it moved. Ukrainian FPV teams were in position before the column arrived. The narrow road between the tree line and the drainage channel was prepared for exactly this purpose. The soldiers who were supposed to reinforce the Russian front line in eastern Ukraine are not there. The positions they were supposed to strengthen are weaker than Russian commanders planned for. And Ukrainian defenders on the other side of that front line have time, a few more days of reduced pressure, that the destroyed column gave them. Ukraine watches every road. Ukraine prepares every corridor. Ukraine destroys what Russia sends forward in the dark. And the front that Russia's reinforcements were traveling toward holds. To understand the full operational significance of this engagement, it is necessary to examine what a destroyed reinforcement column means in the context of the current Russian military situation in eastern Ukraine. Because the soldiers in those vehicles were not simply individuals. They were the output of a manpower system that Russia has been straining to sustain since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And their loss represents a cost that compounds in ways that the direct personnel figure alone does not capture. Russia's infantry replacement pipeline is operating under conditions of significant stress. The initial professional contract force that began the invasion in early 2022 suffered severe attrition in the first phases of the conflict. Subsequent mobilization waves, announced and conducted with increasing urgency, have produced replacement infantry through processes that have been accelerating training timelines, lowering physical and age standards, and drawing on population cohorts that Russian military planners had not originally intended to mobilize. The soldiers in the reinforcement column that Ukrainian forces destroyed in the mid-April darkness were products of that pipeline. Men who had been assembled, minimally trained, equipped, and moved toward the front as quickly as Russian logistics could manage. This is not an assessment of their individual courage or motivation. Some were willing, some were not. What matters operationally is the distinction between the soldiers they were replacing, the experienced contract soldiers, and the mobilized personnel who had been at the front long enough to understand its specific demands, and the soldiers they represented. Infantry effectiveness in the defensive and offensive operations of eastern Ukraine is not simply a function of presence. It is a function of the specific tactical knowledge, the crew relationships, the situational awareness about the specific terrain and specific threat patterns of the sector, and the physical and psychological adaptation to sustained combat that only time at the front develops. The Russian frontline unit that was expecting these reinforcements had been operating at reduced strength while it waited for them. Its commanders had been managing a unit that was understaffed for the operations it was being tasked to conduct. A common situation across Russian formations in eastern Ukraine, where loss rates have consistently exceeded the replacement rate for extended periods. The expected arrival of reinforcements would have allowed Russian commanders to restore their unit to something closer to its authorized. None of that happens now. The unit remains under strength, Its commanders must continue to manage operations with fewer soldiers than their plans assumed. The rotation that tired personnel were expecting is delayed. The reconstituted assault capacity that Russian commanders had planned around does not materialize. The Ukrainian defenders facing this specific Russian unit have gained something that military analysis rarely quantifies directly: time at reduced pressure. When the Russian unit opposite them is under strength, its ability to generate and sustain offensive pressure is reduced. Its fire missions may be less frequent. Fewer observers means fewer fire missions. Its patrol activity may be reduced. Fewer soldiers means fewer patrols. Its ability to respond aggressively to Ukrainian activity along the contact line is diminished. The unit managing its remaining strength carefully does not spend that strength on optional aggressive actions. Each day of reduced pressure is a day that Ukrainian defenders use: position improvement, equipment maintenance, medical treatment for minor injuries that have been managed in the field. Sleep, the most basic operational necessity that sustained pressure denies. The Ukrainian defensive posture in the sector is stronger at the end of the days that the destroyed reinforcement column bought than it would have been if those reinforcements had arrived. The terrain preparation that made this engagement possible, the identification of the road corridor, the assessment of the drainage channel water levels and their effect on off-road movement capability, the selection of the tree line as the FPV operating position reflects the specific environmental awareness that Ukrainian defenders have developed for mid-April conditions in eastern Ukraine. Mid-April in this part of Ukraine is a specific tactical environment. The thaw that began in late March is well advanced, but not complete. Drainage channels that are dry in summer carry significant water in mid-April. Fields that appear trafficable from above have subsurface conditions that immobilize heavy vehicles. Tree lines that were bare in winter have begun to leaf out, providing concealment that was not available 6 weeks earlier. Road surfaces that were frozen solid in February have thawed and softened, reducing their load-bearing capacity and making rapid vehicle movement in darkness more challenging. Ukrainian engineers and planners who selected the engagement point for this operation were accounting for all of these conditions. The drainage channel that prevented lateral vehicle dispersal from the road was a mid-April specific factor. In summer, it would not have been an obstacle. The tree line concealment that allowed FPV operators to establish their positions without Russian detection was enhanced by mid-April leaf cover that had not been present in earlier months. The soft road surface that reduced Russian vehicle speed and maneuverability in the engagement area was a consequence of the same thaw conditions that had filled the drainage channel. The engagement was designed for this specific moment in the seasonal calendar. A different time of year would have required a different plan. Ukrainian planners understood the environment they were operating in and built their engagement around it. The FPV operators who executed the column destruction from the tree line were working in conditions that require specific acknowledgement. Mid-April nights in eastern Ukraine are cold. Temperatures dropping toward freezing after dark, ground still damp from the accumulated thaw moisture, the low vegetation wet from the evening dew that settles as temperatures drop. The operators had been in their positions for hours before the column arrived, maintaining the stillness and the communications discipline that their concealed positions required. When the column entered the engagement corridor and the trigger was given, they were cold. They had been waiting for hours, and they executed their engagement sequence without hesitation. That combination, the physical discomfort of extended waiting in cold conditions, followed by the precise execution of a complex multi-drone engagement sequence on a moving column in darkness, is the operational reality that Ukrainian FPV teams have normalized through months of exactly this type of operation. It is not comfortable, it is not glamorous, it is effective. Russian commanders will adapt their reinforcement movement procedures in response to this loss. They will vary their timing more aggressively. They will attempt to use route diversity to reduce Ukrainian predictability about which corridors to cover. They will increase the spacing between vehicles to reduce the vulnerability of concentrated columns to the type of sequential engagement that destroyed this one. Each of these adaptations makes the next reinforcement attempt marginally harder for Ukrainian forces to intercept. Ukrainian analysts will observe those adaptations. They will update their collection priorities and their engagement planning to account for changed Russian procedures. They will identify the new corridors and the new timing patterns that Russian logistics adapts to. The cycle of adaptation has been running throughout this conflict, and Ukrainian forces have consistently demonstrated a faster adaptation cycle than Russian procedures can sustain. The soldiers who were in those trucks and BTRs in the mid-April darkness were traveling toward a front line that their unit needed them to reach. Ukrainian thermal drone operators were watching them from the moment they moved. Ukrainian FPV teams were waiting in a tree line that Ukrainian planners had selected specifically because the terrain would prevent any effective Russian response to what was going to happen there. The darkness was not protection. The road was not safe. And the reinforcements that a Russian frontline unit was waiting for are not coming. Ukraine watches in the dark as clearly as in daylight. Ukraine prepares the ground before Russia arrives. Ukraine destroys what Russia sends forward to sustain its invasion. And the front holds. One final observation about this engagement deserves to be stated plainly. An observation about what it means that Ukrainian forces are executing operations of this quality in mid-April of this year, at this stage of a conflict that has been running at high intensity for years. The capabilities demonstrated in this engagement, sustained thermal drone surveillance, multi-element FPV engagement coordination, terrain preparation for a specific tactical environment, the intelligence analysis that predicted the column's movement window, did not exist in the Ukrainian military at the level they currently exist before this conflict began. They were developed through the conflict itself, through operations that succeeded, through operations that failed, through the continuous pressure of fighting a large and capable enemy that adapted its own procedures in response to each Ukrainian success. The Ukrainian forces that are executing these operations today are not the same force that began fighting years ago. They are more capable in the specific skills that this specific conflict demands. They understand their enemy's logistics patterns, movement procedures, and tactical behavior at a level that only sustained engagement produces. They have built the equipment, the doctrine, and the inter-element coordination that allows a small FPV team in a tree line to destroy a reinforcement column that Russian commanders believed the darkness was protecting. Russia is also learning, but the evidence from engagements like this one suggests that Ukrainian learning, faster, more tactically specific, driven by the immediate consequence of operational failure, is outpacing Russian adaptation in the domains that matter most for the current character of the conflict. The column moved in the dark. Ukrainian thermal eyes were already watching. The road corridor was already prepared. The FPV teams were already in position. The reinforcements never arrived. The front holds, and Ukrainian forces are still learning, still adapting, still preparing the next corridor for the next column that Russian commanders believe the darkness will protect.